I'm John out at Angel Island, and I'm really glad we can present this program for you. We are one of 280 state parks in California, and this one, like a lot of others, have the parking lots that are closed. For us, that means our boat docks are closed. The public ferries aren't coming out here, and if you did have your own kayak, you could kayak over here to Angel Island and be able to enjoy the park. And so that's really the only access that people have at the moment. But I'm really glad that today we can provide this home learning program for all of you. And it's going to be about a 45-minute program. We're going to talk about a little bit about the introduction, a little bit about Angel Island. We have a wonderful song from one of our interpreters here at Angel Island, also named Aaron, that's going to do a song about an intro song. But first, this island has been a lot of different things over the years, and it didn't always used to be an island. It actually used to be part of the mainland more than 12,000 years ago, but with sea level rise, it isolated Angel Island from the mainland and became an island. The Native Americans were using Angel Island as a seasonal hunting ground, and there's this thing called an island effect that makes the animals a little bit more tame. So it makes sense that they were coming over here for hunting and fishing purposes seasonally here on the island. Angel Island was discovered by Europeans in 1775 by Juan Ayala, and it was on August 2nd. And on the Catholic calendar, that's the feast day of angels. So therefore, based on the Catholic calendar, they call this place Angel Island. And that's how this place got its name. Now, after the Spanish explorers, this place was used as a cattle ranch, kind of interesting. It has 99 years of military history here on the island. In addition to the military history, protecting the bay with cannons, the cove was a quarantine station. 30 years here at this site that I'm going to get more into details, this place was used for regional immigration station. And it was the second largest immigration station in the United States. And this place had the nickname of Guardians of the West. So today, Angel Island is a state park, one of the 280 state parks, and we have this temporary closure, but we hope that you can come out here to check out this island in person. And I wanted to show you a little bit of view out the window because you can see the San Francisco Bay. And that's where we are in California, in the San Francisco Bay. And it's just right outside the window here. And it's a beautiful day, and we're looking north. And if that camera is able to focus, you might be able to see the Richmond Bridge. And this is the view that the immigrants would have had. If you take a look over there, there's the Richmond Bridge. There's a private boater out over there. They do have a dinghy. So technically, it's totally fine if they bring their dinghy over here to the park and enjoy the park, but our boat docks and our mooring bars and our public ferry are closed to the public. But this boat over there could boat on over if they wanted to. So
Hey,
this is the view. Yeah.
Before you launch into the history of Angel Island, what it's known for now, we had a great question. I just wanted to know if you would have a moment to answer. Someone just wants to know, Reagan wants to know, how long ago was Angel Island part of the mainland?
About 12,000 years ago. There's this whole notion of the sea level rise, and that there's a time range of 12,000 to 14,000 years ago with that sea level rise, and that isolated. And there's a lot of islands out in the Farallon Islands that part wasn't an island either. And because of that, it cut off Angel Island from the mainland. That's a great question.
All right, thank you. Oh wait, we have one more. Do you want one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. Was it connected to Tiburon?
That is, yeah. I mean, Tiburon wasn't Tiburon back then, but yes, that is the closest land that we have now. And it's a little bit less than a mile from Angel Island to Tiburon. And there's actually some people that do a swim across what we call Raccoon Straits. And yeah, it's right there. So it would have been there's kind of a peninsula, like a thumb, and then Angel Island just kind of broke off from that. Great question. I'd like to provide, Aaron is going to provide
Yes.
a different Aaron than the ones moderating. But we're going to hear from Aaron right now. And this song is a little bit about what there is on Angel Island and things to do here. Take it away, Aaron.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Angel Island State Park. It's great to have you all joining us today. All right, this is a little song I wrote. The music comes from a familiar tune, but the words are all mine, and here you are. Oh, Angel Island, dear Angel Island, you are in San Francisco, but in your bay. You are a state park of California, California, USA. Oh, Angel Island, dear Angel Island, you are so special in many a way. We walk to miss our recreation. What a way to spend our day. Oh, Angel Island, on Angel Island, hike, bike, or tram ride, what do you say? Or you could even, in the summer, take a tour on a Segway. We're going to talk about the animals now. Oh, Angel Island, on Angel Island, so many mammals you'll see all day. Raccoon and mule deer and harbor seal, but our lone coyote, no way. Oh, Angel Island, on Angel Island, up in our sky find the birds of prey. Red-tail and osprey, and if you're lucky, a bald eagle flying away. Now some plant verses. Oh, Angel Island, on Angel Island, some of our native trees here to stay. Coastal live oak, madrone and toyon, and the California Bay. Oh, Angel Island, on Angel Island, wildflowers and trails lay. Poppy and lupin, Fremont star lily, monkey flower along the way. Oh, Angel Island, on Angel Island, non-native plants come from far away. Pride of Madera and eucalyptus, 13 species in the wind sway. Oh, Angel Island, this is our island, one of our state parks here in the bay. We live and work here, and so could you too. Take a chance and apply today. Thanks, you guys. Back to your program with John.
Yay. Thanks, Aaron.
So I'd like to talk about immigrants coming from around the world. We had 82 different countries that we had immigrants come from around the world, and they arrived by ship. Here's one of the ships that was bringing immigrants from abroad. This ship would enter the Bay of San Francisco, and they called it the Golden Gate even before that bridge was there. And that ship would be in the shelter of the bay out of the storms and the wind. And there would be a smaller boat that you pulls up next to it. And this is the immigration boat. So this is where the immigration process starts, is the immigrants travel possibly 2 to 4 weeks. So on average, 3 weeks, depending on how far and how fast the boat is. And you would be arriving here in the San Francisco Bay. That smaller boat had immigration officials on it. And that boat would have the immigration officials get off that small boat, and they would get on the big boat, and they would start inspecting passengers. And this is what it would look like. You would have the passengers line up, you would have the immigration officials inspecting them. And those immigration officials are inspecting on 3 different categories. Is it legal for that person to be able to enter the United States? Are they sick? And are they likely to become a public charge? And to break that down a little bit further, one of the group of immigrants, when you're looking at is it legal, that were realized that we got to figure out if it's legal that was the Chinese. And under the law that was passed in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act, you weren't allowed to enter the United States if you were Chinese unless you were one of the 5 exceptions. So if it wasn't legal for you to enter, then you'd be brought to Angel Island for further questionings to figure out, in the case of being a Chinese immigrant, are you one of the exceptions? The other thing is, are you sick? They didn't want people bringing diseases in. And in this time, we can relate to that because that is a real concern, particularly somebody that had a disease that didn't have a cure. And that would be a reason for you to leave the ship and come to Angel Island for further health inspections. And then thirdly, that I mentioned earlier, was likely to become a public charge. And they wanted immigrants that were able to work, that could make a living, could support themselves. So if you failed any one of those inspections, and you were likely to become a public charge and be on government assistance and not be able to support yourself, you would come to Angel Island for further questioning. Half the immigrants, they passed those inspections. The first class passengers were not scrutinized about being likely to become a public charge because their money to pay for that ticket was the most expensive on the boat. And it was the second class passengers or steerage or third class passengers that were scrutinized. And if you were allowed to enter the United States, you would just stay on that boat. And in general, half the people were allowed to enter the United States right off of that initial inspection. The other half of immigrants, on average, they had to come on the smaller boat and they had to come to Angel Island to get to the bottom of it, to figure out, in fact, is it legal for them to enter the United States on those categories. Here's a group of immigrants that arrived to Angel Island. This is what it would look like back then. And when I say back then, this place opened up in 1910 and it ran for 30 years. And so this place in 1910 had this dock. These immigrants that you see here failed one of those inspections on the ship, had to come to Angel Island to get to the bottom of it. And these individuals right here, because they were Chinese, they automatically had to come to Angel Island and prove they were one of the exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you had luggage that you could carry with you, you could bring that to Angel Island while you're staying here. And they called that detention while you're staying here. If you had luggage that you couldn't carry with you, it would stay there in the luggage shed that you see on the back of the dock. Here's another group of immigrants arriving to Angel Island. You can see that luggage shed in the back, and whatever stuff you could carry with you, you could have while you're in detention. So that's a little bit of a summary of how the immigrants got here. But I also wanted to show you a couple of buildings that we used to process the immigrants. This is the administration building. It opened up in 1910. And when you take a look at it, you got these little bitty bushes right out front there. And those are the palm trees. And in this building, they processed the immigrants' paperwork. Again, a lot of the paperwork was processed here for the immigrants that never even came here. So this place processed 1 million people's paperwork. 500,000 came here to be further questioned about a variety of things. And those are the immigrants you saw walking down that pier coming here to Angel Island. So 500,000 people set foot on this island and were detained. The women, they were detained here in this building, the second floor of the administration building, where women and men were segregated. The women were in this building that you see here, and the building that I'm in now was the detention barracks for the men. Now, unfortunately, this place only ran for 30 years, and this is what happened in 1940. Take a look at the palm trees. They're 30-year-old palm trees right here. So luckily, this building did not burn. And that's the building that I'm in right now. And I'm in this room here, and I'm going to be looking out of that window. Actually, not quite that window there. So that's the view that I'm going to have right now. And we're going to look at out the window, and you can see that this building that burned, the administration building, is no longer there. So we can see the foundation, and it's really now just part of the park. And that's this view right here that we're going to see. And hopefully that camera can focus in on those palm trees there. That dock is no longer there, but it would go out near where that sailboat is. There's that palm tree there, another one there, and another one there. So, let me show you the view out the window there. So we got 110-year-old palm trees there, there, and there. The administration building's no longer there, and that dock would go out there and allow people to arrive to Angel Island. And why those people are on Angel Island, they were segregated on the island, not just with gender, men separated from the women, but they were also segregated by loosely where they're from. The Chinese, they were segregated with Chinese men and women because they had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Chinese were detained here for extra lengths amount of time because the Chinese had to prove they were the exception to the exclusion law. Then they segregated out the white Europeans. And that's the room that the European men stayed in, is this very room that I'm in now, is where the European men stayed. And then you had a third group of immigrant, everybody else. And that was a largely an Asian population of immigrants. So you had European, Chinese, and then everybody else segregated, also by gender. You'd be in a room like this with 3 bunk beds, 2 bunk beds wide, 3 bunk beds tall, and you would be waiting for the government to figure out if it's legal for you to enter the United States. And they call that detention. You can't leave until the government says you're not allowed and you're deported, or you're allowed to enter and you're landed. In the meanwhile, you're stuck in here in detention. You got 3 meals a day and you're waiting. If you were a European man, you might be waiting in this very room for maybe 2 or 3 days. I feel like I'm in the same bed as the person right next to me. There's not even enough room to sit upright in here. I think if I were climbing up or down in this bunk, I'd probably wake up the person below me or the person above me. But you're only here for 2 or 3 days. Now, the Chinese men and women, on average, they were detained for 3 or 4 weeks. The longest person was detained for 22 months. And that's because the Chinese had to prove that they were the exception to the Chinese exclusion law. And they were really, in fact, allowed to enter the United States. So the government said, hey, if you are a Chinese person and you're a student, a teacher, a diplomat, a merchant, or a son or daughter of a citizen, they'll allow that Chinese person to enter the United States. So I know there's a lot of information I dumped on you. And I have a question for all of you. Why would the government of the United States exclude Chinese but have those 5 exceptions? Aaron, I don't know if we should answer some of the questions if you want to moderate some of those. There's a lot of directions we can go right now and so much more to share with you.
Definitely. And so feel free, if you have an answer to the question that John just posed, you're welcome to type it into the Q&A and I can share that with him as the answers come up. But how about for now, I ask you a few questions, if that's okay. So John, one of the questions is, what was the average time people were there? Because some were here for months. So was there generally an average time?
Depends on who you were. Half the immigrants that came through this regional immigration station, they were just inspected on the ship, boom, straight to San Francisco. If you had any problems with it and you're European, you were detained for 2 or 3 days. If you showed up on a Friday night and your ship came in to the San Francisco Bay on a Friday, you're going to be at least detained until Monday because the immigration officials aren't working on Saturday and Sunday, and you're detained waiting in a room like this until the government officials get back to work and then figure out if you're allowed to enter the country. So on average for the European, 2 to 3 days. On average for the Chinese, 3 to 4 weeks. Now, the longest person was Chinese, 22 months. Now, that individual utilized the appeal system. So if the government says, we don't believe it's legal for you to enter the United States, you're going to be deported. An immigrant had no right to an appeal. And they would appeal to Washington, D.C. And often the appeal board would favor the immigrant, and they would say, okay, you don't have to be deported, you're allowed to enter. The person that was here for 22 months went through 2 appeals. At the end, they were deported, and that was the longest detention here on Angel Island.
And could you just go ahead and repeat, I know you've mentioned it already, but the 5 exceptions to the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Yeah, it's interesting because the United States government was actively recruiting Chinese to come out and build the railroad. Then the railroad's done. 1882, the law, the Chinese Exclusion Act comes out. 5 exceptions. You can't come if you're Chinese unless you're a student, a teacher, a diplomat, a merchant, son or daughter of a citizen. If you're not one of those exceptions, you can't come and you're going to be deported. And those Chinese individuals that came here said, I'm the exception, I'm allowed to enter the United States. And the government was like, we don't know if we believe you. We're going to figure that out if you're one of those exceptions.
And then what would happen when someone was deported? And do we happen to know the name of the person that was detained for 22 months?
I don't have the name of the person detained for the longest. And if you were deported, it would be on the expense of the immigrant. So when you're an immigrant coming to the United States, you're required to buy a round trip ticket. So that means you come to the United States and then back. But if you're allowed to enter the United States, you just give up your return portion of the ticket. And the transportation companies that were running the steamships just benefited by, okay, now you don't have to go back. We're bringing the empty boat back. And the interesting thing is the steam companies are responsible for your food until you're landed in the United States. So while you're traveling across the Pacific Ocean for 3 weeks, typically, they're paying for your meals on the ship. When you're detained here on Angel Island, they're paying for your meals because you're not landed. So the price of your ticket for the ship's passage is on the burden of the immigrant. Then if they don't get into the United States, the burden of going back to the country deported is on that individual. So the government doesn't have to pay for it, of deporting you. And you might be stuck here a little bit extra long waiting for a ship to return back, because if you're here for 3 weeks going through this questioning process, they called it immigration hearings or interrogations to figure out, in the case of a Chinese person, are you one of the exceptions? Then you'd be deported back. And I'd be happy to get into a little bit more details of why the government of the United States passed that law in 1882 excluding Chinese, because people from other countries were not excluded, but it was just the Chinese. Questions, or should I get into more detail on that?
You know, yeah, and if you want to keep flowing, and we'll maybe pause again for questions in about 5 minutes.
Yeah. So that's the real interesting part. And the United States has kind of gone back and forth on, okay, Chinese during the gold rush, you're going to be taxed, a foreign miners tax. Then
All right, and so while John's service comes back in, we're going to just review a few of the comments that we've already received. Really great answers, by the way, everyone. One of the responses to John's question.
hopefully you can hear me.
We just got you back, John. Go ahead.
Okay. So it goes a little bit of back and forth with the government, and the government was actively recruiting Chinese to come out and build the railroad. And then the railroad's complete. The country goes into the depression. And then in 1882, the government passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. And you can simply boil it down to one word of why did the government exclude Chinese when they were allowing students, teachers, diplomats, merchants, and sons or daughters of citizens. And you can boil it down to one word. And any ideas what that one word might be? Comes down to the reason they were excluding the Chinese.
We'll give it just a moment, and you can type in your answers to the chat and I'll share them. So money, overpopulation. That's some of the comments we've got.
It comes down to jobs. They were trying to save jobs for American citizens, and the Chinese had a reputation of being reliable, cheap labor source. They did a great job on building the railroad, a lot of other infrastructures in California and throughout the United States. And they thought that was going to be the solution to the economy because the country went into a depression and they were trying to save jobs for Americans. So they passed that Chinese exclusion law in 1882. And why the immigrants were waiting here, specifically the Chinese, trying to prove that they were one of the exceptions, they were detained for long periods of time. And I want to share a poem with you about how some of the immigrants felt in detention, because that's what they were in. They were in detention. In this room, the European men were detained on the other side of that door. Now, one of the things that some of the immigrants did is they left graffiti behind expressing different things. And in the case of the Chinese, they left a lot of poetry. Some of the Europeans left some names and some dates behind. They actually carved them into the wood of the walls, the name, the dates, the poems. And this poem is carved into the wall on the first floor of the building by a Chinese man. We don't know who because they didn't want to get in trouble for leaving graffiti on the wall. But now it's been translated from Chinese into English. And this is the poem with my best Kansas accent. It's been a long time since I left my home village. Who could know I'd end up imprisoned in a wooden building? I am heartsick when I see my reflection. My handkerchief is soaked in tears. I ask you, what crime did I commit to deserve this? That's a little bit about how one immigrant felt by being detained, where they were waiting for the government to allow them to either enter the United States or be deported. So I know that's a lot of information I shared with you. What kind of questions y'all have for me as I take you to the Chinese side? We were just in the European men side. We're gonna go to the other side of the building now.
All right, let's see. There are lots of great questions. So do we have an idea of, what the lifestyle was while they were there? Like what kind of meals were served to the detainees?
Yeah, so this is the stairway right here that leads to the cafeteria. So if you were one of the European men, that door would open up. You would leave that door. You would go down this very stairway right here. And then the stairs go down to this kind of a long covered stairway. And that's what you see out the window there. And that administration building that burned down, it contained the cafeteria. And where those picnic tables are down there, that used to be the Asian dining hall. And they would have like a seating for the Asian men, or I'm sorry, Chinese men. And then on the other side of the stairs, in a total separately different cafeteria, kind of on the left side there, where that kind of circle on the ground is, that would be the European dining hall. And you would walk down those stairs, and you would be access to 3 meals a day. One of the things about the meals is at first, everybody received the same meal. So the first several years that this place was open, the Europeans got the food that they were used to eating, and they served European style food. But people coming from other countries are like, what's this? Boiled potatoes, stewed vegetables, stew type meals. They weren't used to that. So the Chinese actually did what they called a sit-in, and the immigration officials calls it a food riot. And they were actually successful in not leaving the cafeteria until the army came in and forced them to go back to the detention barracks. But they were able to do a sit-in and a food protest, and they actually hired Chinese cooks to cook Chinese food for Chinese people. Right now, I'm looking down the hallway to the Chinese side of the barracks, and while I'm going down that, let's answer another question.
Great, and yeah, lots of wonderful questions. So thank you, everyone. This is something to consider, but if you're just being held, why did they need to reinforce the metal door with a wood lock?
Well, they didn't want people to get out. And yes, you're just being held, but they had that wooden door. This is the Chinese door, same sort of style of door. You got that little window, that wooden lock in there. When you look out the windows, they have the cages on the windows. And I'm going to take a look outside that window because they had fences. Fences had barbed wire on the top, and they had guard towers on either side of the detention barracks. So even if you got out of the building and you got over the barbed wire fence, hopefully you can see a picture of that barbed wire fence down there, and you got past the guards, you're still on an island. And we're not aware of anybody that successfully escaped off of Angel Island. And there's a reason they put it on an island. They didn't want people getting out. And the same sort of reason is why one of the islands next to us, Alcatraz, that was a prison. And they don't think anybody got off of that island alive. So they were very much building this place very similar to what a prison would be like. But there's a couple of things that's very different about being an immigrant in detention and being a person on Alcatraz. And if you want to type that into your question and answers up there of what's one of the differences, because we know there's some similarities. They're locked up, they can't go anywhere, they're stuck here. But what's a couple differences? There's two that I can kind of think of that are out there. So type in those questions or answers, and if we have some more questions, hit me up. There's so much to cover.
Definitely. So so the question is, again, what is the difference between being a detainee on Angel Island and a prisoner on Alcatraz? Feel free to type in some answers. In the meantime, John, because Chinese were not used to the food being served, did any of them get sick? One of the questions that was asked.
Yeah, there's accounts, and not only in immigrant journals and stories of people that were immigrants here detained afterwards about tummies being upset. One of the ways that immigrants express themselves is through the poetries that they carve on the walls. And there's one about the food not being very good. There's a poem about when you go down to the cafeteria for meals, bring your valuables with you because there's thieves among us. And imagine this very room was used for the Chinese men. The health department said this much space, 25 people could be in a room this size. But when you break it down and you start looking at the number of bunk beds in, there was 100 bunk beds in here. So it was very overcrowded. Now, one of the things that we're all thinking about now is social distancing. Well, in a room this size, you just can't social distance because you're on top of each other. But one of the things that the immigration officials were doing is they were doing the health inspections. And if you were sick, you would be isolated in the hospital. And here's a picture of the hospital, hospital beds in there. So a sick immigrant would be sent over to the hospital either to be able to be cured on their own expense. So you pay for the treatment and you're cured, and then you're eligible to enter the United States. Or if there was no cure, or if it was a disease that was a deportable disease, then you'd be deported. So they were isolating sick people so that diseases didn't spread. One of the things that they were doing here at the immigration station is you had access to the bathrooms, and there were showers and sinks and toilets. But they were using water from the bay for the showers. And they were also having the toilets flush and all the wastewater going into the bay. And, you know, there's other things in the bay from the rivers and the animals and stuff like that. So that was a big health concern that the doctors said, hey, you got to fix this problem. We can't be having the immigrants bathe in salt water. It's not going to be good. So that's a little bit about how they dealt with tight quarters and diseases. One of the things is the immigrants, if you were here for 3 or 4 weeks, you probably don't have that many sets of clothes. So one of the things that the immigrants did not have access to was any sort of laundry facilities. So if you were here for 3 weeks, you didn't have ability to wash your clothes through a proper laundry or anything like that. So the immigrants would take their clothing down and wash it out in the sink the best they could. Wash your shirt in the shower in the sink, and then you wring it out and you're hang drying it, and you're in some close quarters in here. Yeah. So what kind of questions do you have so far?
All right, lots of good ones. So were other, and we've kind of covered this, maybe just touch on it again, were other races detained at Angel Island? And on a side note of that, specifically, were there other races from Asia as well beyond the Chinese?
Yes, the most abundant group of immigrants coming through here were from China, which was number one, which is ironic because that was the group that people from the United States officials were trying to exclude because they wanted to save jobs for Americans. But that was the group that was the most abundant group, and it's the group they were trying to exclude. That's Chinese. Second most abundant group was the Japanese, and then the Russian. But there was considerable number of people coming from India also. But all in all, we had people come from 82 different countries from around the world. Now, when you think of this as an immigration station, it's a regional immigration station. San Francisco is pretty popular. Really got a kickstart of people coming here during the gold rush. So this was a known place to go. But they had other immigration stations regionally in Los Angeles, San Francisco here on Angel Island, Washington, and Oregon. And this was the second largest in the United States. Any ideas what the first largest is? Type it into the question and answer feature. Now, this first largest one was on the East Coast. So they were getting a lot of people from Europe because they just had to just cross the Pacific Ocean. But we had Europeans here too. The Panama Canal was a way that the European immigrants could go by boat from Europe through the Panama Canal, up the Pacific Coast, into California. And if your final destination was San Francisco, it might be way cheaper and easier and faster to go by boat the whole darn way, rather than coming in from the East Coast, coming in through possibly the largest immigration station in the United States, and then coming into San Francisco. So any ideas what the largest is?
Oh yeah, lots of guesses, and I'm pretty sure it's right, Ellis Island.
Yeah, that's the largest one. 14 million people. 1 million people here on Angel Island. And Ellis Island, I just had a chance to go there right before this virus thing broke out. And they're talking about how 98% of the immigrants were able to get through and enter the United States. Depending on who you are here on Angel Island, they were considered the strict immigration officials, the guardians of the Western Gate, upholding the Chinese exclusion law and other laws excluding immigrants from coming in. And If you were Chinese, they would have deported 50% of the Chinese, but the Chinese knew about a right that they had, a right to an appeal. They utilized that appeal and they got that percentage down to 10%. It's interesting about the Chinese, and I know we keep talking about them, but because of the earthquake in San Francisco, burned City Hall because of the fire. City Hall's where you got birth records. The next thing you know, you got a Chinese immigrant saying they were born in San Francisco, therefore birthright citizenship. Then they said, oh, I got a son in China. And they said, I want to bring my son in China. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. If they didn't really have a biological son in China, they called them paper sons. And then they were able to come over as a paper son and get around that Chinese exclusion law. So that's the interesting thing about the Chinese. But if you were coming from India, there was a deportation rate among people coming from India of about 50%. So it just depends on who you are and where you're from or what the deportation rate is. But when you start looking at those numbers, you can see that this place was the Guardians of the West, the strict immigration station. There's an account, we have one of our docents that their family would go back to China to visit family. And they would go up to Oregon, go back and forth from China to Oregon, avoiding this strict immigration station. They were detaining citizens of the United States of Chinese descent, so Chinese American citizen. They were detaining them here saying, we don't believe you, you're gonna have to prove you're a citizen. And they're like, I'm a citizen, here's my paperwork. Well, we think that's fake, you're gonna be detained here for long periods of time. So that just shows that this place was a strict place.
So John, some people are asking about how the detainees were treated, and more specifically, if you came over as a family, you know, with a mother and a father and children, what happened?
Yeah, you'd be segregated by gender. Men were separated from the women, so husbands and wives would be segregated. If you were a child, let's say 11 and under, you'd be allowed to be with mom if you're traveling with mom. So if you were an 11-year-old boy, you could be with mom. If you're a 12-year-old boy, you'd be with dad. But let's say you were a 10-year-old boy traveling by yourself, which really did happen, you'd be with the men. The treatment is you're stuck in this room like this in tight quarters. You have access to 3 meals a day. You have access to the bathroom. You didn't have a lot of time to be outside. They had a recreation yard, but you had to take turns on that. They didn't make immigrants do any work. There wasn't any labor. They were doing a lot of waiting. And one of the things that the immigrants did is express themselves in poetry. And one of those poems that I shared with you earlier, they asked the question of what crime did I commit to deserve this? And if you think about it, is if you're a criminal in prison, you've been convicted of a crime and your punishment is to be locked up. The immigrants here were not convicted criminals. They wanted to enter the United States legally, but they felt like they were treated like criminals. Now, one of the differences between being on Alcatraz, which is a prison, and here is convicted of a crime versus not convicted of a crime. That's one of them. But the other one is you can have your own stuff with you. So if you happen to be an immigrant and you brought a pocket knife with you, you have the ability to leave a poem behind on the walls. If you were an immigrant that had a game, you could play that game. And we have one on the bunks because we have this set up like a museum, as if the immigrants were out at meals. We have some games here that the immigrants would have been probably taking turns on playing. And so they didn't have a lot of stuff that they were doing, and I couldn't imagine the boredom, but expressing themselves in the form of poetry is something that they did. And I think we have probably just a minute left. Aaron, if we have another question, that'd be great. Otherwise, I could do a wrap up.
How about, because this had come up earlier, if you could just touch on if they were punished, if they were caught writing their poems into the walls, and what the punishment was like.
Yeah, well, the immigration officials didn't want the immigrants leaving graffiti on the walls, and they didn't leave their names. So that's one way they didn't get caught, is they didn't leave the names. And if they did, I have a feeling that they did a pretty good job of hiding it. And when I look at the walls right here, you can see the poetry carved into the wood. And then the immigration officials would cover it up with wood putty if it was carved into the wood, or paint over it. And so I'm not aware of anybody that left an account of they got caught and something happened to them. I think they were pretty secretive about doing it at night, doing it in places that they weren't being watched. And we do have accounts from the guards requesting paint to be able to cover up the walls, because you just look all over the walls and there's lots of graffiti on the walls. So I think is basically they were covering it up. And there is one account of a immigrant that was here as a 10-year-old boy, and they said they had a closet. They would kind of lock the immigrants up to kind of like a solitary confinement. But for the most part, the immigrants were on their best behavior because they didn't want to be deported and considered a problem immigrant. Was there another part to that question?
No, but I think, you know, I might just make a nod to the fact that Angel Island has a great Smithsonian digital learning lab. So I'll type that into the chat, but I see a lot of great questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but if you want to learn more about this incredible park and it's very interesting history, you can check out these open education resources found on the Smithsonian Digital Learning Lab. But no, go ahead and conclude, John. This has been really interesting and lots of really good questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them.
Well, I'm glad you joined us and learned about what happened to this second largest immigration station, what it was like to be an immigrant here, detained, some in this very room, and that immigrants left poetry behind expressing how they felt. And some of those immigrants felt like they were treated like prisoners, locked up in a wooden building. Even though they haven't been convicted of a crime, they just wanted to enter the United States legally to make a better life for themselves. But the Chinese immigrants had the Chinese exclusion law excluding them. And a lot of them have expressed themselves of being a pigeon in a cage, locked up in a wooden building. And today, immigration is happening. It's happening in the future. And I'm glad that you had a chance to learn about what happened here 100 years ago, where the government was excluding Chinese immigrants to save jobs for Americans. And those immigrants, while they're detained here in high numbers, felt like they were treated like prisoners. And how does a country today, like the United States, how should this country treat their immigrants, and who should be allowed to enter? And those are two tough questions for a nation to be able to answer. And these are things that we're struggling with today. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of appreciation being sent your way via the chat and the Q&A. So thank you very much, John. And please visit ports-ca.us to learn about more program offerings, both from Angel Island and all across the state, including digital resources like 360 tours and Smithsonian Digital Learning Labs and all sorts of good stuff. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Thanks for joining us.